Hiya, my name is Duncan Green. I work for the London School of Economics and Oxfam, and I've got a few thoughts on how do you design research in order to have impact on policies and practices of governments, corporations, whoever you're trying to influence. So I've got a few slides. First of all, how not to do it. What do we want? Evidence-based change. When do we want it? After peer review. This is a satirical slide from the March on Washington in 2015, but it summarizes, I think, what some academics think is the way to influence change. And I think Oxfam's experience is that that is definitely not the way to do it. And I want to give you some other ideas. So 4 pillars of designing research and carrying out research in order to have impact. First of all, you have to understand the system that you're trying to influence, not just the problem. The academic incentives are to delve into the problem, understand the problem, find solutions, but you have to use a bit of your brain to understand how power is operating in the system, how decisions are made, how change processes take place. For example, is research actually the best way to persuade the people you're trying to influence? It might be anecdotes, it might be personal experience, taking them to see what you're talking about. Who persuades them? Will they listen to researchers? Often the answer is sadly no. They might listen to peers or people they respect or fear. So there's a bunch of other things you have to think about rather than just the brilliance of your research. Framing and timing. So timing is crucial. Research in the wrong part of a political timetable is not going to get listened to. If it's there for when a new government is looking for ideas, when there's a crisis and governments are looking around for solutions to the problems they now have, those are the moments when research gets taken up. So you have to think about the timing of your research and, if necessary, dust off previous research when a window opens and you've suddenly got a chance to influence with it. And then doing research on its own sometimes works, but it's much better if you can use media, social media, campaigns, direct contact and lobbying, other ways to complement the research and get it into the right hands. And then all of this, you need to iterate and adapt. You know, that you won't get it right the first time. You need to see whether it's working, see what can be improved, and then tweak it and change the way you're going. 2 quick examples of what I think is very persuasive research from my Oxfam experience. One is the killer fact. Okay, now a killer fact is a research-based stat which exposes an injustice. It's a juxtaposition of something with something else, which shows that the world is not as it should be. And this is a colleague of mine, Ricardo Fuentes at Oxfam, it was about a couple of days' work. He found a database which gave you the assets of 3.5 billion poorest people in the world from Credit Suisse. And then he used the Forbes list of the richest people in the world and their wealth. And he went down the Forbes list until he got to the same amount as the assets of the poorest half of the world's population. And it turned out the figure was 85. It subsequently came down each year. Now, this had a huge impact. The timing was right. We released it just at the Davos meeting that year, the big meeting of the world's richest people. The media were looking for a story. It went viral. It was fantastic. What it shows is that a basic, well-evidenced killer fact can have more impact than 100 peer-reviewed journal articles. So I think that's one thing you need to think about. How can you present your work as a narrative that's really going to reach people? And the second one, I'm a big fan of league tables. This is a league table Oxfam did of the 10 biggest food companies in the world. And what we did was look at their policies. It would have been far too difficult to look at their practices, but we did a fairly rigorous approach looking at their policies on things like land, gender, support for farmers, and so on. We gave them scores, and then we added them up and ranked them. And the one thing about this is the only people who are happy about this table are the people who are at number 1. The ones at 2, 3, and 4 are going to want to be number 1. The ones at 8 and 9 are going to want to rubbish the whole exercise. But it's a way of getting leverage over highly competitive leaders, whether in business or government. Citizens UK did a similar thing, brilliant thing, on the wages different Whitehall ministries were paying to their cleaners, and did a league table of who was the meanest and who was the most, well, generous is probably not the right word, but who was paying most to its Whitehall cleaners, which really got action going. So I'm going to stop there. There's a reference here for a this was based on a much longer chapter in a book about using evidence to influence policy, if that's what you're interested in, based on Oxfam's experience. Thank you very much.
One of the things I would say is, don't think that you can create the conditions through pure force of will or power of argument. That one of the phrases I really love from a mathematician called Donella Meadows is that we have to learn to dance with the system. And in advocacy, that means understanding the incentives of the people you're trying to influence, understanding the timetables of the people you are trying to influence, understanding when they're open to new ideas and when they're closed, understanding who they might listen to. It might not be you. You might want to get a different messenger to bring your message in. So putting yourselves in the shoes of the people you're trying to influence and then adjusting the message and the messenger and the timetable accordingly is probably the best way to create the conditions, rather than think we just have to create an unstoppable momentum through our own amazing movement. That tends to be much harder. There's a fantastic video of people at a pop festival, and one guy gets up and dances and he looks crazy, and then someone else gets up and dances in the same crazy way, and suddenly they build momentum. It's a fantastic, look it up, it's on YouTube. And what their argument is, that the important thing there is not that you have the leader with the crazy dance. The important thing is the first follower. It's the people who put their own ego aside and say, that is something I want to do, I'm going to get behind them. And then other people start joining. So I think one of the psychologies is not always thinking you have to be at the front. It's much more about who do you want to support. And then when you start to mobilize people, there's a bunch of things. One is to make it fun, just not to think that the hair shirt is the best organizing tool we have. You've got to make it fun. You've got to make it engaging. If you can give people wins early on, it builds momentum. That sometimes you hear people say, if we don't change everything, we can't change anything. I think that's a terrible message in organizing, because it just makes people give up. So you've got to give people wins early on. And don't worry if the energy goes up and down. All the studies of mass movements, social movements, show that they occur in spikes, and that's normal. What happens in sort of history of European social movements, for example, is that you get these spikes of mobilization when suddenly everybody notices that there's a social movement going on. But if you look closer, those spikes are made up of lots of little grains of faith groups and sports clubs and women's associations that come together around a particular issue. And then melt away again. And the grains endure, but the spike disappears. So if your spike comes and then disappears, think about the grains and think about which are the long-lasting bits that will come together next time. So I'll tell you a little story. So I was once on the board of an organization called the Ethical Trading Initiative. And it was a bunch of NGOs. Like, I was from CAFOD, the Catholic Aid Agency at the time, with big companies, supermarkets, garment companies, and trade unions. And we were trying to solve the problem of labor rights abuses in the supply chains of these big companies. And after one of these, and we got to know each other, and you start to build trust. You go down the restaurant or the pub together after the meetings, and even though you come from completely different worlds, you start to like each other a bit. And after one of these meetings, the guy from Sainsbury's came up to me and said, Duncan, could CAFOD and the NGOs campaign against Sainsbury's a bit more? And I went, what? You're from Sainsbury's. You want us to campaign against Sainsbury's? And he went, yeah. The board is thinking of cutting my budget, and it would be very helpful if there were some stories in the newspapers criticizing Sainsbury's, so that I can keep my budget and do the stuff I want to do to improve supply chains. So the point behind that story is that there is quite an interesting dance between high-level influencing or insider influencing and civil society. and you have to be able to play both sides of the game. So people in the room often want the pressure. You know, Lyndon Johnson said to Martin Luther King, I want to do what you say, but you have to make me on civil rights. So there's that dance between insider and outsider, and the outsiders have to recognize that that's part of the game, and the insiders have to recognize that that's part of the game. You're not each other's enemies. You can work together to bring about change. What do you mean by civil society? Right? Civil society is this phrase we bandy about. Do you mean the public? Right? In which case, I think if you're trying to sway the public, you need big narratives, emotional narratives that resonate. You know, and the people who do this best are the faith leaders. And I think, you know, if you look at how churches and mosques and faith groups mobilize people through an appeal to the heart, that's a very important part. Showing that you're right is a tiny part of winning. You know, moving people is a massive part of winning. So there's that emotional connection. There's a tendency, and then if you're trying to convince organized groups of civil society, which is very different from the public, then you have to think, how do they see the world? What is the language they use? And you have to, again, go to where they are. There's a tendency, a finger-wagging tendency amongst activists in many different kinds, where you say, look, I've got this great plan. I've got this great insight. I see where the world is going wrong. I have this plan to fix it. And what you've got to realize is if that's the way you talk to people, you look a bit crazy. Right? So you've got to find a way to engage with them on where they are and find narratives that speak to them, and not say, I am the savior, just just follow me and everything will be all right. I'm not saying that's what, you know, the people on this conference are doing, but it's just it's a kind of, I call it evidence-based humility. You know, that you have to have a level of humility that you don't know everything, you don't know how, you've got some ideas, but you want to hear other people's ideas, and then you build something together. And don't get messianic. I'm very skeptical of messianism in activism. Don't go in and say, human rights doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is climate change, or the only thing that matters is renewable energy. I think that's a battle you're going to lose. Whereas if you can build bridges and say, yes, human rights are really important, and this is one aspect, the stuff we're talking about is one aspect of why human rights are under threat. You know, there's no energy, or your kids can't get an education because they can't study at night because there's no electricity. Whatever it is you're doing, link it to what matters to people. Don't try and replace what matters to people, because that is a really tough ask.